Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're going to give a few minutes before we get started. All right, let's get into it. So we've got a bunch of folks on the line, so let's get started. Hello, good morning, or good afternoon, depending on where you are, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about some of the changes we've seen from Apple and Google around privacy. Specifically, we're going to go over what those changes are, how those affect users' privacy, and also fingerprinting, and what businesses and developers need to do to keep up to date. Before we get started, though, got a little bit of housekeeping. We will have time for questions at the end of this session, so please ask your questions in the Zoom Q&A or in the chat, and then we'll go over them live together at the end. This webinar is being recorded, and you'll be able to find the recording of this webinar on YouTube, on our YouTube channel. And then last but not least, if you have any further questions after this webinar, feel free to reach out to us at support@fingerprint.com. Now, if you're wondering who the person behind the voice is, my name is Keshia Rose. I'm a Senior Developer Evangelist here at Fingerprint. And today I'll be moderating a chat with our co-founder and CTO, Valentin Vasilyev. We're going to talk about all those different changes and what you need to know about them. So without further ado, let's get right into it. All right. Valentin, let's hop in. I want to start off with Apple first. Can you tell us exactly what the changes Apple has been making to their browser for Safari?
Yeah, welcome everyone. I'm very excited to talk about this topic today. And the privacy and security of web browsers is a thing that has been active for several years already, but specifically with Safari 17. We had a new release that was released on iOS 17 and iPadOS 17 a couple of weeks ago. And if you upgraded to that release, you also got Safari 17. So Apple announced several key privacy changes and fingerprinting protection changes in that release. So I want to explain what they are and how they work. So what they shipped in Safari 17 is advanced privacy protection and fingerprinting protection in incognito mode. So if you go to incognito mode, open a private window in Safari, you will see a message saying that now Safari includes the advanced privacy protection and fingerprinting protection. And they introduced several changes to several APIs that they enable in incognito mode only. These changes include changes to how they report the screen resolution, what kind of API outputs the Canvas API will have, and the Web Audio API. So when you need to know your screen resolution, you can ask JavaScript, what's my screen resolution? And Apple will randomize slightly the screen resolution in incognito mode, and thus making it more difficult to get the real screen resolution. And the real screen resolution is one of the signals that's typically used in fingerprinting scripts. It also updated how Canvas API works. If you draw something on a Canvas surface, it will and then serialize that image into a byte stream or a byte array. You will see that the byte array contains some random bits, and this randomness is what makes it makes the process of fingerprinting harder, because the Canvas output will vary slightly for every incognito mode session. So if you have the same image, let's say you drew a triangle on a Canvas surface, and then you redrew that same triangle in incognito mode and then serialized that image into a byte stream, you will see that bytes are slightly different, because Apple Safari now adds a noise component into every pixel that will make it harder to deterministically convert the image into a byte stream. And the same concept applies to Web Audio API. When you generate like a programmatic sine wave, apply some transformations to it, then you want to turn it into a linear form and convert that sound essentially, or audio clip into a binary stream or byte array. You will see that there is some randomness added to each component of the sound, making it harder to create deterministic representation. So all these changes are made to make using like legacy techniques of fingerprinting harder for Safari. So that's the changes.
Makes sense. Tell me, what are some of the motivations you think are behind these changes from Apple?
Yeah, Apple has always like positioned itself like we are privacy focused and privacy friendly company. Our products were designed with privacy in mind, and they used the term privacy quite a bit in their marketing recently. I think it all started in 2017 when iOS 12 and iOS 11 were released. We started to see like multiple releases of ITP, a technology that Apple created to make cross-site tracking harder or impossible. ITP means intelligent tracking prevention. So back in 2017, they started this general trend to enhance user privacy and reduce cross-site tracking ability of developers and browsers. And over time, like this privacy initiative and ITP a little bit died down. ITP lost its steam, I think, and now Apple found itself like competing with Google for mind share. Google now becomes a company that talks about privacy in their browsers. Then there is Brave, and Brave introduced a lot of changes a couple of years ago where they also talked about user privacy. So Apple has to kind of reinvigorate that privacy motion, reinvigorate that theme of caring about user privacy. And with that in mind, I think they wanted to introduce new privacy measures such as advanced privacy protection in Safari 17. So I think it's both a competition angle with Google and Brave browsers, and also like something that they had been doing before, and they want to reinvigorate that.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've got an idea of the changes on the Apple side. How about Google? What are they up to?
Yeah, Google's effort has been larger, more overarching, more holistic, because they're not making like small changes in the API outputs. What they are doing is creating a suite of industry standards in Google Chrome. They started a Google Privacy Sandbox initiative back in 2020, and 3 years ago, where they promised several key sweeping updates to APIs. They promise updates to relevance and measurements APIs that change how we measure the accuracy and relevance and how we work with advertisement, and publishers and developers use those APIs. They also promise privacy preserving API changes that freeze the user agent version increment. They partition their cookies with the CHIPS initiative. They introduce first party sets. And there are still several APIs that they kind of announced but didn't work on them, which is a privacy budget, IP protection, and private state token API. These three haven't been released, but also part of this big privacy sandbox initiative that Google has been working. But I guess the biggest change that drove all the API changes is the deprecation of third-party cookies. So as you know, third-party cookies are commonly used to not only enable like shared functionality such as chat widgets, they also are used in ad space to make it possible to do cross-site tracking. And Google wanted to phase out and deprecate third-party cookies, but at the same time give developers new APIs that be good alternatives to implement all kinds of functionality. And when they started with the privacy sandbox, they specifically targeted two areas. One is relevance and measurements of ads, attribution, marketing campaigns, and privacy preserving API changes on the user agent level. So with relevance and measurement APIs, they want your browser to be in charge of what kind of ads you see, and they want to reverse the roles in how the bidding for ads and showing the ads happens. And they want developers to still be able to measure the effectiveness of ads and attribution, but they want to achieve it in such a way that it doesn't make cross-site tracking possible. And this is how they're tackling this. They introduce Topics API to make your browser aware what kind of interests you have and declare that your topics of interest. They introduced a Protected Audience API to make retargeting possible without third-party cookies, and shared storage where you can globally write, but you have limitations on reading. These are like main APIs that were shipped as part of the Google's privacy sandbox, and that are important for ad space and market attribution space. For privacy focused APIs, user agent API reduction happened and was generally rolled out with Chrome 1.14, I think, where they stopped incrementing minor and patch versions of the user agent. And user agent string, if you ask navigator.useragent, it's used quite a bit to identify a specific browser version that helps in browser fingerprinting. Now they froze the user agent, and instead they introduced the client hints API that you can use to get the browser OS version, platform, and capabilities. But this is more like a privacy-friendly APIs. So I would say these are the main changes that were released. And Google's approach was a more like overarching, like I mentioned. They, instead of shutting down or changing the existing APIs, they introduced new APIs that should gradually replace the old APIs. And the third-party cookie removal will happen next year. By the end of next year, they first will simulate removal this year. Then we'll gradually in stages disable third-party cookies in like Q1, Q2, and Q3, and then they will in Q4, I think, fully shut down third-party cookies. They will live like 3% for A/B testing, but in general, by the end of next year, I think third-party cookies will be removed, and developers will have a year to adjust to the new reality and start building using new APIs in mind. So this, I think, is a summary of what Google Chrome did with the privacy sandbox.
Gotcha. It sounds like a much different approach, at least as far as motivations go, from what Apple is doing. Is that right?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Apple's kind of reacted to some privacy concerns, and they made very easy and quick changes to like 3 APIs. They introduced randomness in their API outputs in incognito mode, specifically making legacy fingerprinting techniques less useful. Google is trying to change how industry as a whole in ad publishing market attribution space works with browsers. Before, everyone relied on third-party cookies to do this type of work. Now they want to change that, and they want to make browser the authority in deciding what kind of content you see, rather than some kind of third-party company that can track user movement across the internet and perform cross-site tracking. So they want to be your browser in charge instead of a publisher, for example. And that's the key difference in how like Apple and Google tackle this. But there are similarities too. Like, for example, Apple introduced iCloud Private Relay, like in, I think, Safari 14, where every network request that goes, that happens in Safari will go through a set of servers hiding your real IP address. And this is a very interesting change because it makes it not possible even for Apple to see your real IP address. And Google wants to introduce IP protection as part of the future changes to the privacy sandbox that is very similar to what Apple did already. Also, there is a private state token API that Google hasn't yet released, and Apple had a similar initiative where they can verify the authenticity and maliciousness of each device using a network provider. I think these are similarities, but overall, I would say Google's approach is more holistic, overarching, and developers will likely find Google a better partner to work with over time, and Google will have better answers for the API changes in the future, I think.
That makes sense. You've mentioned a lot of different changes, some that have already taken place, some that are coming in the future. But for the ones we have or know about so far, will this change the average user's experience in their day-to-day browsing?
I would say not. Like I'll address Safari and Google separately. With Safari, that random noise that they're introducing, it doesn't change how you perceive the audio that you're hearing. It's not going to be like noticeable. If you are using playing an online game and it's built using Canvas API, you will not see the difference on the screen because those subtle differences, like they shift slightly the how images are built. They're like RGB components, but they are not like visible to humans. So I think this will not affect how Safari users, for example, use Safari. With Chrome, there might be some like sites that break because of this change. Like a lot of chat widgets, a lot of third-party components, they rely on third-party cookies, and I think a lot of websites will break. But because Google has offered well-designed suite of new APIs to replace the old legacy alternatives, I think developers have enough time to react to that. But I think some websites will break, but then developers should fix them. Yeah.
Gotcha. And speaking of developers and what they can fix, what are some of the implications for the developers that maybe are trying to deal with privacy and device identification?
Yeah, this is actually an important question. I think there are a lot of implications, and browser capabilities, browser intelligence, and device intelligence has been very hard, and it's getting increasingly harder and harder. It now is increasingly more complex to understand if your website web application will continue to work in this like changing privacy landscape. There are no clear answers like, will my cookies continue working in this scenario? What the lifetime of cookies will be? So developers definitely, I think, will struggle implementing basic website functionality that deals with identifying users and browsers. And they will need to build a lot more expertise in browser identification and device intelligence. And that's one thing. Adopting all the new APIs, it's hard. You need to learn all their capabilities, rewrite large code bases. So there'll be changes that will require a lot of work. So going with, for device identity space, with a specialized company like Fingerprint can be helpful in like dealing with all that complexity in a reliable and predictable manner.
Gotcha. Now, speaking of fingerprinting and the actual techniques that are being used, are there any techniques in particular that are now very much so less effective or even obsolete?
Yeah, like there was a whole generation, like it almost decade long generation of tools built around the concept of like collecting API outputs from high entropy API components such as Canvas, Web Audio, user agent, maybe IP address, add to the mix, and you combine them together, you pass them through a hashing function, and as a result, you end up with a hash string that semi-uniquely identifies your browser. With these new changes that Safari introduced and Google also partially introduced, all these legacy techniques will almost stop working because there is going to be an incognito mode every time a noise component added to the outputs, and the identifier, because hash is deterministic, even when single bit changes, the hash changes. That identifier will be changing every time you go in incognito mode in Safari 17. So definitely all techniques on Safari 17 stop working completely. You need to process information differently, and the process becomes harder. You need things like fuzzy matching, you need non-deterministic hashing, you need some kind of machine learning and statistical approaches to be able to still process the data reliably and generate the same IDs without losing the accuracy. So I think we'll see like several key legacy fingerprinting scripts will deliver much lower accuracy in Safari 17.
And is that the same on the Google side as well?
On the Google side, I would say the impact will be less pronounced because the changes that they made are not as impactful on the actual hashing and fingerprinting. On the Google side, yes, they froze the user agent, but you could ignore it. You lose accuracy, you reduce entropy of your signals, but it's possible to ignore that. there is now chips, which is cookies that have independent partition state. You can no longer use like third-party cookies with Privacy Sandbox when it's fully done. You could disable those as a developer, but as a result, you would lose accuracy. However, I think Apple's approach will actually randomize your fingerprints instead of making them less accurate. So I would say Safari versus Google. Safari fingerprints stop working completely in incognito mode. Google fingerprints become less accurate as a result, but will continue to work in a like mediocre way a little bit. So this is how I would compare like the impact on these two browsers.
Gotcha. Well, since we're losing some of the accuracy, or like you mentioned in Safari, those fingerprints become random, does that mean that there's a greater chance for bad actors to get away with a fraud?
There definitely is, because now as a bad actor, what you need to do if someone is using a legacy fingerprinting script, all you need to do is open that window in incognito mode. The script will generate a new ID for you, maybe change your IP for a good measure, and then you will essentially become unrecognizable for that website because you have a new IP, because you could easily spoof your email, and because your fingerprint is different. Recognizing that you is you and that identifier is actually the old identifier is nearly impossible. That's why you need a new kind of solution that can reliably continue identifying browsers even when Safari 17 is used, even when Privacy Sandbox is used, and fingerprint identification platform does not rely on cookies, does not rely on IP addresses. It uses machine learning and fuzzy matching to aggregate information together. And with fingerprint identification, you can actually continue identifying users and browsers, even in incognito mode, even on Safari 17. So I would say definitely a closer look at the legacy techniques is a good first step to tackle this.
Great. So as developers and businesses go through over time, Google and Apple will continue to make changes. What are some ways that these businesses can stay on top of fingerprinting and ensure that they're accurate?
Yeah, I'll shamelessly plug Fingerprint blog, because I think we regularly publish like content that explains industry changes, what's happening, the timelines on the changes. So definitely subscribe to our blog. I think that's a good first step. You will have a pretty good grasp of the industry updates in real time. And we try to provide all our customers news frequently. We have a newsletter too. Subscribe to that, and you'll see more updates from that. And in general, like if you're curious about how fingerprinting changed in the last several weeks, feel free to reach out to Fingerprint. We are always happy to get on a call and discuss your specific situation with like identification needs, discuss your use case, and we have more than a decade of industry experience in that area. We can provide expertise and advice there.
Makes sense. And now my last question for you before I take a look and see if we have any questions from the audience. That's a reminder to the folks in the audience as well. If we have any additional questions, go ahead and add them now. But the last thing I want to ask you is, I want to know about Mozilla and Firefox. How does that play into these new privacy changes?
Firefox is interesting because it used to be a leader in the privacy space, and it used to be a browser that tech-savvy users picked first. I was a Firefox user like several years ago, and they offered several like important initiatives. Enhanced tracking protection, for example. They pioneered, to my knowledge, the partitioning of client-side storage. And then Apple also tried to do that, like they tried to use heuristics for that. And now Google repeated that, but Firefox was a leader like back in 2019, 2020. But then when they released Enhanced Tracking Protection 2.0, I think that was the last update from them where they actually pushed the privacy forward. And since then, I struggle to recall like any significant updates from Firefox. So I would say now they are more like lagging behind Google and Safari. There is also Brave that introduced several important changes, like API farbling and randomization is what Brave, I think, started to use generally, and it was a good technique that they use. So, but now I would say Safari and Google are in 2023 are the leaders in the privacy awareness and privacy protection space.
Gotcha. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and take a look and see if we've got any questions from our audience. But thank you so far for this great overview. I know I have learned a lot. I hope also the folks in the audience, you've learned some things. So let me take a look and see what we've got in our Q&A. All right, we do have a couple questions. Okay, first up, will the fingerprint JS identification become less accurate on the whole as a result of these browser changes?
Fingerprint identification, our professional version hasn't become less accurate. We worked preemptively before Safari 17 was released. We started when Safari 16 was released. We started to think what the changes will be in Safari 17. And when Apple announced Sonoma like back in summer, we actually like install all beta releases of macOS, iOS. We have special bots that monitor significant changes in device API support. So we created an internal release that dealt with all the changes and measured its accuracy, false positive, false negative rate with current Safari versions like 16.4, for example. And we identified like the API changes that were different, and we fixed them over time. And by the time Safari 17 was released, we were fully ready. Our product didn't lose any bit of accuracy. I should say that we also have our source available library called Fingerprint.js. That's a client-side library that you can see on GitHub. You can use it for hobby projects. For commercial projects, you need a license. This product also was adjusted for Safari 17 because we conditionally disable and enable some signals there. And their accuracy, I need to say a few words about accuracy and stability, because these are different things. In our source available client-side library, we first handled how Safari 17 deals with stability of fingerprints, and we fixed that first. And then we separately pushed a release to handle the accuracy changes. So for the source available library, the stability is the same as always. Accuracy is slightly lower. And if you want like full production grade accuracy, we strongly recommend using fingerprint identification instead, because this is a commercially supported product that you can use for the most demanding use cases, whereas the source available Fingerprint.js library is more like a hobby project that we maintain and for research purposes too.
Gotcha. Okay, so if you want the full 99.5% accuracy, use Fingerprint Pro. That accuracy has not changed. Sounds
fingerprint
good.
identification, yes.
Awesome. That's right, because we also have smart signals. We're expanding in our products, I forget. All right, let's see. Next question I've got here from our audience. Is there any standardization in the works by the major browsers to agree on similar approaches?
Some APIs, I think they were successful in standardizing, but some they are not. They create competing standards. I think they try to persuade major players like Google creates a group of people who are industry experts. They justify that why their version of standard is the best, but sometimes they fail and they create competing standards. Like, for example, with Google's relevance measurements APIs, there is an attribution reporting API, and there is also private click measurements on the Apple side. Even though they tried to, I think, create a single standard, they kind of created two competing standards as a result. There is also the private state token API, and Apple created a very similar but slightly different version of that. There are some changes that look similar, like IP protection and iCloud Priority Relay, but still, it's not the same standard, and it's not standardized as a browser API. It's more like an implementation detail. So far, I think Google and Apple are kind of failing to create a single set of standards. Even though Google creates those web standards are not supported by Safari. So I don't know how we can call them real standards. So far, I would say no. There is no single set of standards. It's more like competing standards from Google and Apple side.
Gotcha. Hopefully, maybe we can see something in the future where they come together on some of these APIs.
Yeah.
All right, let's see. We've got a couple more questions here. They're starting to come in now. We're getting a good pace. The next one I have is asking about IP addresses. So they want to know, how much does IP address contribute to a visitor ID? How accurate is the geolocation or IP addresses that we return in our APIs? And they ask because of Chrome's IP upcoming masking, which I think you touched on a bit.
Right. IP addresses play a small role in identification. It's one of the signals that we use. The way our technology works is we combine a lot of signals, about 100, and IP is one of the of that 100 signals. So it's not like the most important signal. It's a powerful signal, but we don't rely on it. If an IP is different or IP is disabled entirely, we can still identify. And instead of having like 95 signals, you will have 94 signals. So our product can work without IPs. With IP changes, iCloud Private Relay, by the way, you need a paid subscription for iCloud Plus, I think $1 per month to enable iCloud Private Relay. It's not a feature available for everyone. You need to pay for it. That's why the adoption is much lower than maybe Google will have with IP protection. Every time you open an incognito mode or a new session in normal mode, it will likely give you a new IP address in the general area closer to you. And it will be hosted like on Fastly or maybe Akamai or maybe like some other partners that Apple has. So this makes it more difficult for companies to rely on the same IP. You kind of need to rely on fingerprinting instead of relying on the IP. And because we don't rely on IP addresses ourselves, a solution like fingerprinting would be even more important when IPs keep like changing and keep rotating for every new session. So I would say it's a change that makes fingerprint identification even more appealing to developers and customers. And IP masking, can you please clarify the question, like what kind of masking you mean? Like, is it Apple's masking of IPs or Fingerprint's ability to mask IPs? Because these are different concepts.
I'll take a look and see if they come back with the clarification. But on the next one, let's see. We've got, oh, maybe they already came in. Let's see. Oh, nope, that was a different question. There are just so many. Next one we've got here is, do these changes also make ad tech platforms' visitor tracking also difficult in their walled gardens? How can device fingerprint techniques from Fingerprint help with that?
I would say for ad publishers and developers, I would encourage to use new Google APIs like Topics API and Protected Audience. It was formerly known as Fledge, to do the retargeting so that users' browsers are in charge of the data and bidding all the information. And this is the right way to do that. We, as a company, we don't condone cross-site tracking, and we support identifying and tracking browsers in the first-party context. So for ad space, my answer would be use new APIs by Google and adapt them, stop using third-party cookies gradually. And I think your understanding of your advertisement performance and relevance will not suffer if you implement all the new APIs correctly.
Great. The next one we've got here is talking about the differences, I think, on mobile. Do similar changes and challenges also appear in the mobile device tracking, not just browser experience, but also native apps?
Yeah, for native apps, there are a lot fewer like changes, because I think if almost all changes are web-based. There are still things that come to mind for mobile SDKs. One is on Android, you will get, as part of the privacy sandbox, you will get an isolated process that runs your advertisement code. And this process will be sandboxed from the rest of the applications. This way, the process that runs in that sandbox will not have access to data or essentially file system information. If it runs in the process, it has access based on permissions, but it still has access. When it runs outside of the process in a separate process, it will be fully sandboxed. So I think that's from ad space on Android side, the change that I can think of. Apple, there are like all the changes that happened outside of Safari 17, like changes to how permissions are displayed in Apple Store, new Apple approval policies, Apple now requiring explanations of certain APIs, why they are used. There are changes to how like ID for advertisement, ID for vendor are used. So there are a lot of changes, but all of them are unrelated to Safari 17 and happened gradually throughout the last couple of years, I think. These were most impactful for the mobile SDK space.
Gotcha. All right. And I think we've got our last question here. This might be in response to your question about clarification on the IP masking, I think, because they're asking if we have the ability to detect real IP, specifically when iCloud Private Relay is on.
We don't. iCloud Private Relay hides your IP. We published a vulnerability a while ago when we used WebRTC to find the real IP, but I think since then, Apple fixed that vulnerability. Now, unless there are any vulnerabilities, and we don't use vulnerabilities in our products, we report them. There is no way to find your real IP because it goes through like a couple of servers. There are 2 jumps, and then like a Fastly endpoint IP is exposed to a website rather than your real IP. So finding your real IP was possible with WebRTC before, but is no longer possible, I think.
All right, I think that was our last question. I'll wait maybe a second or two just to see if anything else comes in.
Yeah, if we don't have any questions, I'd like to maybe expand a little bit while we're waiting for more questions about the real IP. iCloud Private Relay is a Safari technology. It's not a like system level technology. If you enable iCloud Private Relay and go check your public IP in Safari, you'll get a different result than if you do it with Google. If you're using Google Chrome on macOS and have iCloud Private Relay enabled, it will kind of defeat the purpose of it. You need to use a real VPN, like a system level VPN, to actually pass all the system level traffic through VPN. Because if you hope that all the traffic on your like MacBook will go through an iCloud Private Relay node, it will only happen if you use Safari, and it will not happen if you use a different browser. You need a real VPN for that.
Gotcha. Okay, I think that actually is all our questions. We did have one come in, but I'm just going to answer this one myself because the question was, how do they find that blog that you mentioned? And that is at our website, fingerprint.com/blog. And if that's all the questions we have, then thank you so much, Valentin, for your time. And thank you, everyone who attended today. I hope you got a lot out of this, a lot of information, and got your questions answered. If you have any additional questions or you want to learn more about Fingerprint, you can reach out to us at support@fingerprint.com. And until then, I hope you have a great rest of your day. That's all.
Thanks,
Take care, everyone.
Oh, yeah. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.